At my own Thanksgiving table, the moment I realized my daughter-in-law didn't see me as family anymore was when she looked me straight in the eye and said my food wasn't worth serving. I had spent 2 full days preparing that dinner, measuring every ingredient the way my late husband used to like, setting the table with the good china we only brought out once a year, and polishing the silverware until I could see my reflection in it, a reflection that looked a little older this year, a little more tired, but still hopeful that tonight would feel like home again. The house smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon, the kind of warmth that used to wrap around us when Daniel was still a boy running through these halls, when laughter came easily and no one checked their phones at the table. I remember adjusting the napkins one last time, smoothing the fabric as if I could smooth the tension I hadn't yet admitted was there, telling myself that families go through phases, that things would settle if I just kept showing up, kept giving, kept being the one who held everything together. Jessica arrived late, as she often did, her heels clicking across the hardwood floor with that same confident rhythm that always seemed just a little too sharp for this house. Her smile perfectly in place, but never quite reaching her eyes, and Daniel followed behind her, quieter than I remembered, offering me a quick hug that felt more like a habit than a choice. We all sat down, plates filled, glasses raised, and for a moment it almost looked like the Thanksgiving I had been holding on to in my mind, the one where everyone belonged, where every chair at the table meant something. I served Jessica first, the way I always had, placing the plate gently in front of her, watching her glance down at it with an expression I couldn't quite read at first, something between amusement and irritation, and then she let out a small laugh, the kind that makes people look up even when they pretend not to, and she said, "You call this food?" Like it was a joke, like it was harmless. But there was nothing light about the way she said it, nothing accidental about the pause that followed. I felt my hand tighten slightly around the serving spoon, the metal cool against my palm, but I didn't respond, not right away, because I was still trying to understand how we had gotten here, how a table I had built for love had become a place where I had to measure my own worth. No one corrected her. No one even looked surprised. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his turkey into small, careful pieces, as if precision could somehow replace courage, and the rest of the family shifted in their seats, exchanging quick glances that said more than words ever could. I nodded once, slowly, as if I had heard something completely ordinary, as if this was just another comment to let pass. But inside, something quiet and steady began to change. Because it wasn't just what she said. It was how easily she said it. It was how no one stopped her. And it was how, in that moment, I realized this wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something I had refused to see for far too long. I kept serving the rest of the table as if nothing unusual had happened, my movements steady, practiced, almost automatic, the way they had been for decades, because when you have spent most of your life taking care of others, your hands learn to continue even when your heart hesitates. I placed mashed potatoes beside Daniel's plate, added green beans to my sister's dish, refilled glasses that were already half full, anything to keep myself occupied, anything to avoid the silence that had settled over the table like something heavy and unwelcome. Jessica did not touch her food at first. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her fork resting untouched against the edge of her plate, studying the meal as if it were something beneath her, something that required evaluation rather than appreciation. And then she glanced around the table with that same small smile, waiting, almost as if she expected someone else to agree with her. No one did. But no one disagreed either. That was the part that stayed with me. The quiet acceptance. The absence of even the smallest correction. I lowered myself into my chair at the head of the table, the seat that used to feel like a place of belonging, and for a moment I simply looked at them, really looked, noticing things I had missed. Before, the way Daniel avoided my eyes not just now, but every time Jessica spoke, the way my sister kept her gaze lowered, stirring her food without eating, the way the conversation, when it finally resumed, moved carefully around me, as if I were something fragile or inconvenient. I picked up my fork and took a bite of turkey. It tasted exactly the way it always had, tender, seasoned just right. The same recipe I had used for over 30 years, the same one Daniel used to ask for when he came home from college, the same one my husband used to compliment with that quiet pride that made all the work feel worthwhile. Nothing had changed about the food. That much I knew, which meant something else had changed. something I could no longer ignore. Jessica finally lifted her fork and took a small bite, chewing slowly, then setting the fork down again with a soft clink that seemed louder than it should have been. "It is a little dry," she said, not looking at me this time, speaking instead to the table, to the room, as if I were not the one who had spent hours preparing it. Daniel nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly, and that was when I felt it, not a sharp pain, not even anger, but something colder, something clearer, a realization that settled into place with quiet certainty. This was not about the meal. It had never been about the meal. I set my fork down gently beside my plate and folded my hands in my lap, the same way I used to when I listened to my husband talk about his day, calm, attentive, composed. Across from me, Jessica was already reaching for her phone, her attention drifting away from the table she had just disrupted, and I watched her for a moment longer than I normally would have, noticing the ease with which she moved on, the lack of consequence, the assumption that nothing she had said required acknowledgement or apology. Around her, the conversation picked up again, softer, more careful, as if everyone was trying to return to something that no longer existed. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let my eyes move from one face to another, and for the first time that evening, I stopped trying to make it feel like before. Because before was gone, and in its place was something I needed to understand, something I had been overlooking piece by piece, moment by moment, until it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. I did not say anything. I did not need to. I simply sat there, listening, watching, and letting the truth begin to form in the quiet spaces between their words. The conversation moved on, but it never really recovered. Not for me. Not after what had already been said and what had not been defended, and I began to notice how every word that followed seemed carefully chosen, not to include me, but to move around me, as if I had become a piece of furniture at my own table, present but no longer part of the room. Jessica started talking about a new house they had been looking at, something modern, she said, with large windows and an open kitchen, the kind of place that did not need heavy wood furniture or traditional decor, and she laughed lightly as she described how she wanted everything to feel clean and minimal, how she could not stand spaces that felt outdated or crowded, and while she never looked directly at me, I could feel the direction of her words, the quiet comparison, the subtle dismissal of everything I had built over the years. Daniel added details here and there, mentioning square footage, neighborhood prices, interest rates, all in a tone that sounded more like a business discussion than a family conversation, and I listened, not interrupting, not asking questions, simply letting the information settle, piece by piece, the way I used to listen when my husband would explain something important, except this time, I was not being included in the decision, only exposed to it. "We are thinking of selling this place eventually," Jessica said, almost casually, as she reached for her glass. And that was the moment something inside me aligned with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, because this place was not just a house. It was the home my husband and I had paid off over 30 years, the home where Daniel had taken his first steps, where every wall held a memory that could not be replaced or simplified into something modern and clean. I looked at Daniel then, really looked, waiting for him to correct her, to say something that acknowledged the reality, that this was not a shared asset to be discussed lightly, but he only nodded again, the same quiet, careful nod he had given earlier, and I understood that this conversation had not started tonight, that decisions had been made long before this dinner, long before I was allowed to hear about them. My fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, tracing a small, familiar groove in the wood, one I remembered from years ago when Daniel had dropped a toy truck and left a mark that I chose not to sand away, because it felt like part of the story of this place, part of what made it ours, and as I sat there, listening to plans that no longer included me, I realized how easily something meaningful could be reduced to inconvenience in the eyes of someone who had never carried its weight. Jessica continued speaking, her voice smooth, confident, outlining timelines and possibilities, mentioning renovations and potential buyers, all of it framed as if it were already decided, as if my presence at the table was a formality rather than a necessity, and I let her speak. I let her reveal more than she probably intended, because there is a certain kind of truth people offer freely when they believe they are no longer being questioned. I did not interrupt. I did not challenge. I simply listened, And in that listening, the final pieces began to fall into place, not as scattered doubts anymore, but as something solid, something undeniable. And for the first time that evening, I was not trying to hold on to what had been. I was beginning to understand what was coming next. As Jessica continued outlining her plans, her voice steady and assured, I found myself no longer fully present at the table, not in the way I had been just minutes before, because something in me had shifted, something that quietly pulled me backward through time, through moments I had once dismissed, moments that now returned with a clarity that felt almost unsettling. I remembered the first time she had rearranged my kitchen without asking, moving things just slightly out of place, telling me it was more efficient that way, and I had smiled, telling myself it was her way of settling in, of making the house feel like hers too. I remembered how she began to host small gatherings without including me, explaining that I needed rest, that I should not worry about entertaining anymore, and I had accepted that, thinking she was being considerate, not realizing I was slowly being removed from spaces I once held naturally. There were birthdays where I was informed of the time instead of asked, holidays where I was given instructions instead of invitations, and each time, I adjusted, I adapted. I told myself that families change, that roles evolve, that stepping back was part of growing older. But sitting there now, listening to her speak about selling this house as if it were already decided, those moments no longer felt like natural changes. They felt like steps, deliberate, quiet, consistent. I glanced at Daniel again, watching the way he leaned slightly toward her when she spoke, the way his responses mirrored hers, not in words but in tone, an agreement that required no discussion, and I realized how gradual it had been, how I had not noticed the distance forming because it had been built one small moment at a time. My husband used to say that people reveal themselves in patterns, not in isolated actions, and I had always believed that, yet somehow I had not applied it here, not when it mattered most. The table in front of me was still filled with food, dishes I had prepared with care, recipes passed down through years of repetition and memory, and yet none of it seemed to belong to me anymore, not in the way it once had, because ownership is not just about what you create, it is about whether it is valued, whether it is respected, and tonight had made it clear that something fundamental had changed in how I was seen. Jessica laughed at something my sister said, a light, easy sound that blended seamlessly into the room, and I noticed how quickly the others responded to her, how naturally the attention shifted in her direction, as if she had become the center of gravity in a space I once held without question. I rested my hands in my lap again, feeling the quiet weight of realization settle deeper, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady, undeniable, and I understood then that this was not about reclaiming a moment or correcting a comment. This was about understanding the structure that had been built around me without my awareness and deciding what I would do now that I could finally see it clearly. I did not interrupt her. I did not defend myself. I simply listened, because sometimes the most important thing is not what is said in response, but what is learned in silence. And in that silence, I began to see not just what had been happening, but what would need to change next. The rest of the evening unfolded in a way that would have felt familiar to anyone else at the table. Conversations drifting from one topic to another, plates slowly emptying, glasses being refilled, the kind of quiet rhythm that makes everything appear normal on the surface. But for me, every word carried a different weight now. Every glance, every pause, every small decision revealing more than it had before. I noticed how Jessica spoke with certainty about timelines, about what would happen next spring or by summer, as if the future had already been agreed upon, as if the house, my house, had already been placed into a category she could manage and reshape. Daniel followed her lead without hesitation, adding details when needed, reinforcing her ideas with the kind of casual agreement that comes from long, unspoken alignment, and I realized then that I had not just been left out of a conversation, I had been left out of a process that had been unfolding for much longer than I had allowed myself to see. My sister finally spoke up at one point, her voice careful, almost hesitant, asking a small question about whether I had plans to travel anytime soon. And it was such an ordinary question, the kind that would have meant nothing on any other day, but tonight it felt different, like it had been placed deliberately, like it belonged to a larger discussion I had not been invited into. Jessica answered before I could, saying that it might be good for me to get a change of scenery, that sometimes people needed time away to reset. And she said it with a smile that looked thoughtful, even considerate, but there was something underneath it, something structured, something that did not feel spontaneous at all. I turned my head slightly and looked at her, really looked this time, not at the surface she presented, but at the consistency of it, the way her words always seemed to move in a direction that benefited her, the way every suggestion quietly repositioned me further from the center of my own life. I did not respond to her comment. I let it sit there, unanswered, because I had started to understand that responding too quickly, too emotionally, would only keep me in the role they expected me to play, the one who reacted, the one who adjusted, the one who accepted. Instead, I picked up my glass and took a small sip of water, letting the silence stretch just long enough to notice who filled it and how. Daniel cleared his throat and shifted the conversation again, moving it towards something neutral, something safe, and the others followed, relieved, it seemed, to leave that moment behind without examining it too closely. But I did not leave it behind. I held on to it, the way you hold on to something important not because it is pleasant, but because it is revealing. The table was being cleared now, plates stacked, leftovers discussed, the ordinary end of a meal that had been anything but ordinary. And as I stood up to carry a dish toward the kitchen, I realized something with a calm certainty that surprised even me. They had already made their plans. They had already decided where I fit into them. The only thing that had not yet been decided was what I was going to do about it. And for the first time that evening, that question did not feel overwhelming. It felt necessary. I carried the last plate into the kitchen and placed it gently beside the sink, the porcelain making a soft, familiar sound as it met the counter, a sound I had heard thousands of times before, but tonight it felt different, as if even the smallest details were asking to be noticed, to be remembered. The kitchen was quieter than the dining room, the voices behind me slightly muffled now, blending into a low hum that no longer demanded my attention, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to stand still without performing, without filling the space with movement or obligation. I turned on the faucet and let the water run over my hands, warm and steady, watching it move across my skin, grounding myself in something simple, something real, while everything else began to settle into place with a clarity that did not need urgency. I had spent years responding, adjusting, explaining, trying to preserve something that had already begun to shift without my consent, and now, standing there in my own kitchen, I understood that continuing in that way would only keep me exactly where they expected me to be. So I did something different. I said nothing. I dried my hands slowly, folded the dish towel neatly, and placed it back where it belonged, each movement deliberate, not because I was stalling, but because I was choosing not to rush into the role they had quietly assigned me. When I returned to the dining room, Jessica was still speaking, her tone light, confident, describing how things would be easier once certain changes were made, how everyone would benefit from a fresh start, and I noticed how naturally she included herself in every future she described, how seamlessly she excluded me without ever needing to say it directly. I took my seat again, not at the head of the table this time, but slightly to the side, and no one commented on the shift, no one questioned it, which told me more than if they had. Daniel glanced at me briefly, a quick, uncertain look, as if he sensed something had changed but could not quite identify what it was, and I met his eyes for just a moment before looking away, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a calm distance that felt new even to me. I did not need him to explain anything tonight. I did not need anyone at this table to clarify their intentions, because they had already done that in ways they did not realize I had been watching. The rest of the conversation passed over me again, but this time, I was not trying to follow it, not trying to remain included. I was observing it, quietly noting who spoke, who agreed, who avoided, who led, and who followed, and with each passing minute, the picture became clearer, more defined, less open to interpretation. By the time the evening began to wind down, coats being gathered, polite goodbyes exchanged, I was no longer searching for answers in what they said or did. I already had them. What I needed now was time, not to react, not to confront, but to prepare. Because understanding something is only the first step. Deciding what to do with that understanding is where everything truly begins. And as I stood by the door, watching them leave my house one by one, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not feeling uncertain. I was feeling ready. The house felt different after the door closed behind them, not quieter in the way it usually did after a gathering, but clearer, as if the air itself had settled into something more honest once the performance was over. I walked back into the dining room and stood there for a moment, looking at the table that had once been the center of everything, now scattered with half-empty glasses and folded napkins that no one had bothered to take with them, small signs of an evening that had revealed more than it concealed. I began to clean, slowly, not out of habit this time, but with intention, noticing each detail as I moved, the untouched portions on Jessica's plate, the way Daniel had barely eaten, the way certain dishes had been pushed aside without comment, and I let those details stay with me, not as insults, but as information. I carried the plates to the kitchen one by one, rinsing them under warm water, stacking them neatly, my movements steady, my mind no longer clouded by confusion or hurt, but focused in a way that felt unfamiliar and precise. When everything was put away, I dried my hands and walked toward the hallway, pausing briefly at the small desk where I kept the household papers, the place I had managed for years without question, bills, records, documents, all organized in a way that made sense to me and had never needed explanation. I opened the top drawer and looked inside, not searching for anything specific at first, just reacquainting myself with what was there, what I had, what I knew, because for the first time, I was not assuming that what I believed to be true was still intact. I pulled out a folder, then another, scanning dates, signatures, statements, and I began to notice something subtle but important, small changes in recent documents, updates I did not remember initiating, details that had been handled without my direct involvement. My name was still there, but not always where it used to be, not always in the same position, and I felt that same quiet certainty return, the one that had been forming. All evening, now sharpening into something more defined. I sat down at the desk and turned on the small lamp, the soft light illuminating the papers in front of me, and I took my time, reading carefully, not rushing, not reacting, simply absorbing what was in front of me. The house was completely silent now, no voices, no movement, just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the distance. And in that silence, I began to see the outlines of a plan that had been set in motion without my full awareness. It was not chaotic. It was not careless. It was structured, gradual, designed to shift control without confrontation, and that was what made it effective. That was also what made it vulnerable. Because anything built on quiet assumptions can be undone the same way, quietly, carefully, without announcement. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer, not because I was finished, but because I had seen enough for now to understand where I needed to look next. I turned off the lamp and stood there for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle around me. And for the first time since the evening had begun, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not out of satisfaction. Not yet. But out of recognition. They thought I had been unaware. They thought I had been passive. And for a while, they had been right. But not anymore. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of stillness that usually brings comfort, but this time it carried something sharper, something purposeful, and I woke up earlier than usual without needing an alarm, my mind already moving through the pieces I had begun to uncover the night before. The house felt different in daylight, not warmer, not colder, just clearer, as if the truth had settled into the walls overnight and was now waiting to be acknowledged fully. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, not the large one in the dining room, but the smaller one by the window where I used to sit with my husband in the mornings, and for a moment I allowed myself to remember how simple things used to feel, how decisions were shared, how nothing important was ever done without a conversation. Then I set the cup down and reached for my phone. I did not call Daniel. I did not reach out to Jessica. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed in a long time. Someone who had once handled the legal details after my husband passed. Someone who understood the structure behind everything we had built. I pressed the call button and waited, listening to the soft ringing on the other end, steady, patient, until a familiar voice answered, older now, but still precise, still attentive. I introduced myself, explained briefly that I needed to review some documents, nothing urgent, just a few things I wanted to understand better, and he agreed to meet later that afternoon, his tone professional, but with a note of curiosity that told me he understood there was more beneath the surface. I ended the call and sat there for a moment longer, letting the decision settle, not second-guessing it, not softening it, simply accepting that this was the next step. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but not idly. I moved through the house with intention, gathering documents, organizing them in a way that would make sense to someone else, noting dates, signatures, anything that felt out of place or newly introduced. And with each page I reviewed, the pattern became clearer, more structured, more deliberate than I had first realized. There were small transfers, adjustments, permissions that had been updated under the assumption of convenience. Things that might have seemed harmless on their own, but together, they formed something else entirely, something that pointed toward control being shifted gradually, quietly, without confrontation. By the time I left the house, I was no longer uncertain about what I would find, only about how far it had already gone. The office was just 15 minutes away, a drive I had made countless times before, but today it felt different, not because of the distance, but because of what I carried with me, not just the folder in my hands, but the understanding that whatever had been set in motion could still be addressed if I was willing to see it through. When I walked into the building, the receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to wait, and as I sat there, watching the quiet movement of people around me, I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to feel until that moment. I was not here to ask for help. I was here to take back clarity. And once you have clarity, everything else becomes a matter of choice. I sat across from him as he reviewed the documents in silence, his glasses resting low on his nose, his eyes moving carefully from one page to the next, and I did not interrupt, did not explain more than I already had, because I understood that clarity does not come from rushing the truth. It comes from letting it reveal itself completely. The office was quiet except for the soft sound of paper shifting and the occasional note he made with his pen, small, precise marks that seemed to carry more weight than any words spoken at my dining table the night before. When he finally looked up at me, there was no surprise in his expression, only confirmation, the kind that does not need to be dramatized to be understood. He explained everything in calm, measured terms, how certain permissions had been adjusted, how access had been extended, how decisions could be made under specific conditions that I had not fully questioned at the time. And as he spoke, I felt no shock, no anger, only a steady alignment between what I had sensed and what was now being laid out clearly in front of me. Nothing had been taken outright. That was not how this had been done. It had been positioned as help, as efficiency, as trust, each step small enough to seem reasonable on its own, but together forming a structure that allowed control to shift quietly away from me. I nodded once, slowly, not because I was accepting it, but because I understood it, and understanding changes everything. He asked me what I wanted to do next, and for a moment, I let the question sit in the space between us, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it without hesitation, without doubt. I told him I wanted everything reviewed, corrected, restored to its original structure, every permission reconsidered, every access point reassigned, and I said it calmly, without emphasis, because this was not about confrontation, it was about precision. He nodded in return, already making notes, already outlining the steps, the timelines, the process required to make those changes effective and binding, and I listened carefully, asking only what needed to be asked, not more, not less. By the time I left his office, I was not carrying uncertainty with me anymore. I was carrying a plan. The drive back home felt shorter than before, not because the distance had changed, but because I was no longer thinking about what had happened. I was thinking about what would happen next, about how each piece would be put back into place, not the way it had been, but the way it should have remained. When I walked into the house, it felt the same as it always had, quiet, familiar, steady, but I was not the same person who had left it earlier that day. I placed the folder on the table and looked around the room, not with nostalgia, not with loss, but with clarity, and I understood something with a certainty that did not need to be spoken out loud. They had believed I would not notice. They had believed I would not act. They had believed that silence meant acceptance. And for a while it had, but not anymore. Now, every silence had a purpose, every step had direction, and every decision would be mine again, not because I demanded it, but because I understood how to take it back without ever raising my voice.